Welcome to the Rebound Rundown. I'm your host, Paul Fritchner. This is your daily digest college basketball show that covers everything you need to know about your favorite team. From game previews to recaps to press conferences and breakdowns, we have you covered. Every Monday through Friday with your morning commute, wherever you get your podcast, and make sure you subscribe on YouTube. Welcome into the Rebound Rundown. I'm your host, Paul Fritchner. Make sure if you're watching on YouTube, you go down and hit that subscribe button. If you haven't already, there's going to be plenty more content like this as the summer goes on. And if you're listening in audio form, you subscribe wherever you're listening as well. Today's show features an interview with Jon Rothstein. We talked about this year's transfer portal in general, how crazy it's been. We talked about Xavier's hire of Richard Pitino and what that roster is starting to look like. We talked about the Big East in general. Then we talked about Cincinnati, what next year will look like for Wes Miller and how much pressure is on the Bearcats to win and make the NCAA tournament in 25-26. And also, we wrapped up the show with some thoughts on the Big 12. Hope you enjoyed this interview with Jon Rothstein. Great to be joined by Jon Rothstein here ahead of May 1st. Jon, how are you doing today? Thanks for taking a few minutes.
Awesome, Paul. Cheers to you.
Cheers to you too, Jon. Let's get right into it. Before we start talking about the specific Xavier and Cincinnati, the Big East, Big 12, I want to talk about the transfer portal in general because it feels like this year more so than in years past. Every year it's gotten more and more out of hand, I guess you could say. But this year specifically, you see some of the numbers that are being thrown around for these players. You see just the hysteria of these players committing to different places, some guys committing, then decommitting, going somewhere else. From your perspective, from what you're hearing, what has the transfer portal been like this year compared to years past?
Well, I think there's been a case of inflation. I think for what people were playing a year ago for really, really good talent, really, really good players, those prices have roughly tripled in about 12 months. And I think that's been the astronomical change that a lot of programs throughout college basketball have had to deal with. And I think it further reiterates the structure that is needed as we embark on this new era of college basketball. Sorry, just got to decline a call right here. Never great.
You can take it if you need to take it.
No, it's not breaking. It's okay. If it was breaking, I'd have to tell you to hit pause. But I think that's the one thing, Paul, that is without question something that, we're going to have to rectify and also recalibrate moving forward. I don't think we can stay as we are currently constructed in terms of the scenarios, in terms of player movement. I mean, look, it's a really, really good thing that players can get paid now. There is no doubt about that. But there is also no league that exists in professional sports where every player is a free agent every year and there's no salary cap. So that, I would say, is the big, big challenge right now surrounding college basketball. Now, I will say this. Because of the positives of these new rules in college basketball, fringe players at the professional level no longer have to try and go professional and make money. They can stay in college and make a really, really good dollar, which is a positive for college basketball. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons why the games themselves have been better than they've been in a long time. Everything obviously leading up to the games, though, themselves is a little bit shaky.
When you look at how the transfer portal went down this year, and I think the overall sentiment has been maybe this is the tipping point, right? Maybe this is the point in the transfer portal where going forward you might not see it as crazy. But I feel like we've said that every year. Now, the House settlement and whether that gets approved or not is going to obviously play a huge role in that going forward. But do you get the sense that it's still, even after this year, just going to keep going up and up? Or do you think that teams eventually are going to, I don't want to say run out of money, but when you don't see that return on investment from donors and from everyone else, do you think that maybe there is a tipping point here?
I'm not going to speculate on speculation. I do know this. We can't keep moving forward at the rate that we're moving forward. And what I mean by that is if a star player a year ago was worth $10, let's just say, and now he's worth $30, the guy can't be worth $90 next season. We can't keep tripling the cost of high-end talent in the portal every single year. That's just not sustainable.
All right, let's get into the specifics here. We're going to talk Xavier and Cincinnati on the show today, and we'll start with the Musketeers, who hired Richard Pitino after Sean Miller took the head coaching job at Texas. Richard Pitino comes to Xavier from New Mexico. Before we get into the team and how it's constructed right now, Richard Pitino, John, your thoughts on the coaching hire?
Yeah, tremendous hire. I think also it was really, really positive that Xavier spread its wings and went outside the Xavier family. Obviously, it had not done that, really in the past hires that were made by the school. And I think if you look at what you're getting in Richard Pitino, you're hiring somebody that's on the way up. Richard Pitino did a great job at New Mexico. Richard Pitino also beat a Big East team last year in the NCAA tournament in Marquette and won multiple games last year against power conference competition. So I think he's going to bring, obviously, an exciting style of play. It's going to take time to get the roster right for Xavier. I think that's one of the hard parts right now about getting a new job. It's a bonus when you can go from the Mountain West to a program like Xavier, but also in addition to that, it's going to be really, really hard for new coaches to retain in this current climate. So what do? You have to put a whole new roster together. And Paul, we're not going to know what that roster really looks like and what really the formula is until you get into probably October and even November. So we love to speculate on speculation and so on and so forth. I don't, but a lot of people do about, well, there's so much activity. There's so many people getting commitments. That doesn't necessarily mean that's a good thing. We've seen several programs in college basketball overhaul their rosters a year ago, and they didn't come close to reaching the NCAA tournament. I'm not insinuating that Xavier is going to follow suit, but cautious optimism is okay. Blind optimism is not.
The way that Xavier constructed their roster, you talk about retention this year, multiple players on this roster have 2 or 3 years of eligibility left. Now, in the age of the transfer portal, maybe not all of them stick around, but I think for fans that are hopeful for, development, to see retention, to see some players that you can hang on to and be a fan of for multiple seasons, that is an attractive part of this coaching hire, that you went out and you built a roster around that. Now you also have a couple of guys, Trey Carroll, somebody from Florida Atlantic, who you're hoping can be a difference maker at the Big East level, that can translate up, who is only eligible for 1 year. Isaiah Walker, son of Tyrese Walker, who played at Xavier, only eligible for 1 year. A lot of transfers from the Missouri Valley, obviously some guys out coming from the Mountain West, and then one transfer, Malik Moore, from the Big West as well. Do any names, Gabriel Pizzato from Evansville, do any names stick out to you from this Xavier roster so far?
The guys that you mentioned, obviously, Philip Borovichinen was a starter on a team in New Mexico that won a game in the NCAA tournament. But again, this is what speculating on speculation does. We obviously are excited. And it's not just about Xavier. It's about any team in the transfer portal. Because there's so much activity right now during April and May and even March to an extent, people get excited, and there's this belief that just because a player is picking a school, that's automatically going to mean that the player is going to be a really, really good player, at this school. The bottom line is this: Xavier has a brand new roster, and those players are going to have to be good enough to go on the road and compete at St. John's and compete at Creighton and compete at UConn, compete at Georgetown, and the list goes on and on. So again, we have to have cautious optimism, but you can't have blind optimism. I think Xavier's done a really, really good job at rounding out a roster, but beyond that right now, we just don't know.
Looking at the Big East in general, you see some of the commitments that UConn has picked up. Just a few minutes before we started recording this, Alex Caravan announced that he will be coming back to UConn next year. They pick up Mike Nardi on their coaching staff. Obviously, UConn is going to be right there toward the top of the Big East. St. John's has overhauled their roster through the transfer portal. They're going to be one of the favorites in the Big East. And then Creighton, I think, has done a fantastic job in the portal. What do you think of the Big East in general and what they've done over the last month?
Well, you hit it right on the head. St. John's, UConn, and Creighton have been the three most productive teams in the transfer portal out of the Big East. Creighton really recalibrated its roster nicely. Owen Freeman and Josh Dix were two players who started and produced at a high level at the University of Iowa. You also have a couple of players back from last year's team that won a game in the NCAA tournament, Jason Green. Jackson McAndrews. So Creighton's well positioned to again be an NCAA tournament team under Greg McDermott. UConn really amplified its backcourt by getting Silas Demery Jr. from Georgia. He gives them a big guard in the mold of a Tristan Newton. They'll pair him with Solo Ball. Malachi Smith from Dayton, nearby where you are, is a very, very good backup in the Big East. And you have to hope, obviously, that Alex Caravan has a better season this year than he did last year. But he is also a seasoned pro that's 13-1 in the NCAA tournament in the last 3 seasons. And then you have Taris Reed, Jalen Stewart, Jaden Ross. So UConn has all the requisites to, again, be a top 10 team with better guard play this year under Dan Hurley. They're going to be, I think, right at the top of the Big East. And then I think you can make this statement regarding St. John's. We don't know how the pieces fit yet right now, but pound for pound, inch for inch, St. John's has the most talented roster in college basketball. Now, similar to what I was talking about to a different degree, though, regarding Xavier, we have to wait and see how Rick Pitino is going to mold that clay. But I think if you're just looking man for man right now, St. John's top to bottom has the most talented roster. Now, there are certain things intangible-wise that you can't measure in terms of talent, like the returning intangibles of Braden Smith and Fletcher Lawyer at Purdue, or what Houston's program has obviously done. But I think you're going to see a scenario, if Milos Uzan stays in the NBA draft for Houston, you are going to see a scenario where St. John's could be as high as number 2 to start next season.
If that's breaking, you can take that.
No, it's not breaking. I'm just responding to text. You tee up your next question.
All right. So last question here on Xavier in the Big East, because you're a New York guy yourself. What do you think of it, not just really for Xavier in the Big East, but across the sport? Because we saw New Mexico play at St. John's at Madison Square Garden earlier this past season, and what that meant for Richard Pitino playing his father, Rick Pitino, just for the sport in general and the headlines and everything else, to have father and son in the same conference. It's certainly something that a lot of people are going to be paying attention to nationally.
Well, I think if you look at Rick Pitino's really legacy as a head coach, it's the amount of head coaches that he has produced by his own stewardship. The former assistants that he has are not matched by anybody in college basketball. And really, I don't think, anywhere in basketball in terms of any level to begin with. I mean, think about this for a second. 4 of Rick Pitino's former assistants, Tubby Smith, Billy Donovan, Mick Cronin, and Kevin Keats, have all coached in a Final Four. And now if you're looking at the Big East, 2 of Rick Pitino's former assistants, his son Richard and Kevin Willard, are head coaches in the Big East. So if you look at it, 3 out of the 11 head coaches are tied to Rick Pitino's tree, himself obviously the head coach at St. John's. But no, it adds obviously a built-in storyline when St. John's plays Xavier, when Villanova plays St. John's, even when Villanova plays Xavier. The Pitino tree is now a major storyline and a major bullet point, in terms of the Big East storyline. There's no doubt about that.
All right, let's talk about Cincinnati, because if you look at what happened to the Bearcats this year, they were top 10 on KenPom in the first week of December. They had a very talented roster, and they ended up missing the NCAA tournament. They haven't been to the tournament since 2019. Wes Miller's trying to get there. They hire a GM and Corey Evans this year, trying to reconstruct this roster. They go out in the transfer portal. They pick up a few pretty significant additions, I would say, at this point through the portal. What's your take on where Cincinnati is right now, John, and what they have to do going into next season?
Cincinnati has to make the NCAA tournament next season. It is a black and white type scenario. There is no in-between for Cincinnati in 2026. The Bearcats and Wes Miller have to make the NCAA tournament. They weren't close to the bubble in 2025. They were a little closer in 2024. But this program has not been in the NCAA tournament since Mick Cronin was the head coach. And as you know, went to 9 straight NCAA tournaments. So, Cincinnati is a proud program. It's a program that I'm old enough to remember when Mick Cronin was the coach. People were frustrated that Cincinnati wasn't in the Final Four. If you're the Cincinnati fan right now, I have to ask you this question. Would you take those days back? Would you take back knowing that every year, regardless of circumstance, you knew you were going to be hearing your name on Selection Sunday? Because let's face it now, Paul, John Brannon took over from Mick Cronin, did a really nice job the first year in 1920 when he inherited Jaron Cumberland, Trey Scott, Keith Williams, had Cincinnati on the cusp of the NCAA tournament, but the NCAA tournament was then canceled. Cincinnati then, I believe in 2021, advanced to the title game of the American Athletic Conference tournament under John Brannon, lost that game. And then really, since Wes Miller has taken over, Wes has done a really good job putting a roster together. But the Bearcats have not been close to March Madness. And now you're entering a pivotal year for Wes Miller. And he knows that. This is obviously a job that you expect to be in the NCAA tournament every single year. You need to make the NCAA tournament for Cincinnati. And there's really nothing else to talk about when you talk about Cincinnati. That is the only way that Cincinnati's season can be considered a success.
Mustafa Chiom, a transfer in from UCF, is a difference maker for them. Sincere Harris, Jalen Haynes, Kirk Kriisa, obviously a very familiar name to college basketball fans. He finds his way to Cincinnati next year. And then Jason Celestine as well. So when you look at the portal, when you look at what Cincinnati is trying to do, and you talk about reconstructing this roster, do you feel like the way Cincinnati has attacked the portal and what they've done, I know you don't want to speculate here, but just in general, that they're going to be able to compete for a tournament bid next year? Do you like what they've done?
I mean, they've stabilized, obviously, their 5 spot with Chom, who I liked a lot this year at UCF. There's been some other pieces that I think are positive. Jalen Celestine is a really, really seasoned, polished college player. I like the fact that Jizzle James is back. There's some retention in the backcourt, but very rarely do you see teams win at the highest level who are constantly flipping their roster. So I think from a personnel standpoint, there is some positives for Cincinnati, but we need to see how this comes out in the wash. And I remember just during the Final Four looking this up, there were 8 teams, obviously, that played in the Elite Eight, and then 4 advanced to the Final Four. And when you think about those teams, okay, and you think about the dynamics that of all the teams that went to the Final Four, there was a lot of retention among those 4 teams. I mean, Duke was the only one that didn't obviously have a lot of retention. They did have Tyrese Proctor and Caleb Foster back, but you look at Florida. Florida had Walter Clayton, Will Richard, and Denzel Aberdeen, who has since obviously left, in their program the season prior. They also had Alex Condon and Tommy Houck. That's your national champion. Houston, other than Milos Uzan, had a team full of returning players that returned 80% of its scoring from the season prior. You can also say the same thing about Auburn. So if you're looking for the highest levels of college basketball in terms of success, you're looking at teams who retain a lot of players.
Last question for you here, John.
Yeah.
Just your overall thoughts on the Big 12 in general.
It's a changing of the guard, Paul, and it's interesting because really Kansas and Baylor had such a stranglehold on top of the Big 12 standings for so long. But now because of NIL, we are seeing other teams come to the forefront. Houston, BYU, and Texas Tech will enter next season as the teams to beat in the Big 12. Obviously, Houston is going to wait on Milos Uzan, in the NBA draft process. That's a big decision to monitor. But those 3 teams I've ranked right now in the top 10 of my Rothstein 45, and I think they will be unequivocally the 3 top teams to start next season out of the Big 12.
John, I appreciate you taking a few minutes today. It's almost May. Catch up on your sleep, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Paul. This is only April.
Thanks for listening to today's show. Again, make sure you subscribe on YouTube or wherever you're listening in audio form, and I'll talk to you next time.